Hey there, friends. Welcome to another episode of Common Life. My name is Cort, and I'm the senior pastor at South Highland Presbyterian Church in Birmingham, Alabama. In today's episode, we are going to think together about what I would say is probably the single most challenging question about the Christian faith. Where is God in a world filled with so much pain and suffering and evil? And why does God so often seem silent in the face of those realities? To help us think about this question together, we're going to talk to Collin Hansen. Collin works for a little ministry called the Gospel Coalition. Perhaps some of you have heard of it. He's also an author. He's written a bunch of books, but most recently he has written a short, incredibly compelling book that addresses this very question. This is a wide-ranging conversation. We talk about literature, we talk about history, we talk about the Bible, and Collin helps us bring it all together in what I think is a really helpful way. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. Hello, Collin. Welcome to the Common Life podcast. It is good to see you.
It's good to see you as well. Thanks, Cort.
It's been a little bit since we've actually hung out.
That's true. That's a disappointment to me. I'm not sure if it is to you, but it's a disappointment to me.
Well, I've noticed you've been spending a lot of time at the ball field. Give me the update. What's going on in Mountain Brook youth baseball these days?
Man, you don't want that update. I'll give you the sanitized version. No, I really enjoy this crazy May. My older son now is 10, and I might have the chance, Cort, to start it all over again with my soon-to-be 4-year-old son. Just kind of funny to think about, but we should have a good time. We have so many great local ball fields and so many great families, and so it's really fun to be able to, you play against your friends in town, your friends from school, and then you all team up with the kids across your town, and you put on the Spartan jersey and you compete against the Patriots over in Homewood, or the Rebels up in Vestavia and Hoover and Spain Park and all these different places, Chelsea in our league. So it's just really, really fun. Mostly people don't take it too seriously. There are moments, but it's really, I'll just put it this way, Cort. I have a love-hate relationship with youth sports because we do take them too seriously and they take up too much time and they distract a lot from church. At the same time, given the bigger problems we have with technology these days, having a bunch of kids outside without phones doing physical activity with a bunch of parents who have nothing to do except hang out and talk to each other, which you don't do very often with your neighbors anymore. I don't know. There's a lot worse things than that.
Yeah, well, it looks like you're having fun out there.
Yeah, we are.
So real quick, for the people who aren't familiar with you and some of your work, you wear a lot of different hats. So who are you and what are you up to?
Yeah, so I serve in a few different capacities within the broader ministry of the Gospel Coalition as Vice President for Content, Editor-in-Chief, and then Executive Director of the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics. That's named for Tim Keller. Tim was a longtime friend and colleague of mine. Still miss him a great deal after he died 2 years ago, just about to the time when we're talking here. And so Gospel Coalition is a ministry that he had started that serves Presbyterians, Baptists, Anglicans, non-denominational, all sorts of different people with resources. But then locally, I just happen to live locally, mostly because my wife is from this neighborhood. But beyond that, I have a long-standing relationship with Beeson Divinity School. So I have an office at Beeson, co-chair of the advisory board, and then also teach cultural apologetics as an adjunct professor. So got a lot of deep roots locally. Also serve in a variety of capacities at Redeemer Community Church, where I had been an elder for a number of years over in Avondale. So we started there as soon as we moved here in 2012, and are happily members there today.
Well, before we talk about your new book, I want to talk about one that you wrote not too long ago. You sort of wrote the first biography, and I'm sure there will be others to come, of Tim Keller. So you were friends with Keller. You spent a lot of time with him and his wife, Kathy, I'm imagining, through this process. And so I guess my question for you is, why are you not Presbyterian?
I don't know. There's still time, Cort.
That's right. And we will pray. We will pray.
Hey, if you're in Birmingham, you know a lot of great Presbyterians, including the Gatliffs.
Let's talk about your new book, which recently came out. It is called Where is God in a World with So Much Evil? It's a fairly short little book. It's part of a broader series. Is that right?
Yeah, part of a series we have with the Gospel Coalition and Crossway called Hard Questions. So longer than an article, shorter than a typical book, and trying to be addressing relevant and hard, difficult contemporary questions.
Well, I think you probably got the hardest of all the questions. This question of where is God in a world with so much evil? This is, I would say, arguably the most challenging or compelling objection to the Christian faith today, and it's one that if you're in the church, one of the privileges of being in the church is that you're invited into people's seasons of suffering, and so you see it a lot. And so I hear this question a lot as a pastor, and I don't know if I always have a satisfying answer to give, which we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But this does seem to be in our cultural moment, like the question of there's so much pain and evil in the world. If God is good, where is he in the midst of that? And so I'm curious, I know that you are a historian as well, and I'm curious if this question has this always kind of been the question that Christians and people who have been contemplating the Christian faith have been asking, or is this sort of a more recent question that people are wrestling with at an increasingly high rate?
Yeah. It's a great and perceptive question, Cort, and it probably depends on your definition of recent. As you were asking the question, I'm running it over in my head thinking, yeah, this is a recent development, as in the 1700s. That's the way a historian talks. So, yeah, I mean, it is a recent question. It's not one that had predominated throughout the church's history. Part of what you'll see with the rise of what's known as theodicy, these questions about good and evil and about God's responsibility with them, so you do see a corresponding rise through the age that many will call the Enlightenment, and seen as a shift towards secularism in the aftermath of the religious wars of religion and the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, and all of that. So, yeah, one of the things Tim Keller would actually often talk about himself is that we have a bigger problem with this question today and with God himself than earlier generations did. It's not that they didn't suffer. It's not that they didn't have a lot of questions about that. In fact, the only way I could write this book is because the Bible itself is full of people asking those questions. And we'll get to this, I'm sure, later in the interview. But the entire book of Job is precisely because of this issue in there. So in that sense, it is timeless. But what has shifted, Cort, is that we do, generally speaking, as humans, think of ourselves on a higher moral plane than God is. We think that God is subject to our judgment, which is probably due to a modern conception that God is basically a projection of our conscience. And you can look at Freud and others to be able to discuss that psychological notion, which obviously we reject. But if God is more or less a projected figment of our imaginations, then of course, we're the ones who are in the place of judging him. But a lot of what happens in the essential question is that we expect that God should have to answer to us. It's not okay if something is happening. God has to make that case. And I don't want to get too far ahead here, but one of the reasons why I found Fyodor Dostoevsky such a compelling dialogue partner for this book, and have for the 20 plus years that I've been reading and studying and teaching him, is because he understood and wrote about that shift and personified that shift in the Brothers Karamazov by putting Jesus on the stand, the courtroom stand, and having the accusations leveled toward him. So the short answer is, it is fairly recent if you consider the last 300 plus years recent, but it's also ancient. It's in the Bible itself. And yes, the turn toward the self in modernity is certainly a contributing factor to why so many of us feel as though things are more difficult. One thing that's just stood with me a long time, Cort, is that it's not necessarily the case that we suffer less than other generations, because life still ends the same way. We still lose everyone we love, or we lose our loved ones one way or another, whether we're dying or they're dying. It's it's a 100% certainty. So getting older, all those things, those are ever present. But there were more common, I think, widespread tragedies in other generations. And so in some ways, we are desensitized to death because we've pushed it away. And so, yes, these questions about suffering also become, I guess, in many other generations, suffering was an expected norm. It was simply couldn't be avoided. We expect that either through medicine or money or blame or politics or government, that someone or something should be able to solve our suffering.
One of the things I've noticed when people will bring this question to me, it's people who are wrestling with the Christian faith or who are skeptics. They'll pose it as a philosophical question, and what I found is that the more you dig a little bit, you realize that there is a really personal pain there at the core, some sort of key experience that this question is being asked out of. And so I'm curious for you, as you were thinking about this question and writing this book, tell me a little bit about your own experience of wrestling with this question. Has this been a particularly challenging stumbling block for you in your faith at any point?
I think, Cort, you're exactly right when you're talking to pastors and even for just the rest of us as Christians in the church, that when we get this question, it is very rarely in the abstract. And thus, and I was sensitive about this, I'm not sure that I hope this book is written in such a way that people who are going through something can read it and relate to it. But I don't want to say that that's universal. This may not be the book that you should be reading when you're going through those kinds of things. That's okay. I mean, I did my best to try to be sensitive, but it may not, philosophical and biblical exploration may not be the primary thing you need that moment. The thing you may need in that moment is the comfort and the presence of your friends and ultimately the ministry of the Spirit through God's Word and God's overall presence. But oddly enough, though I have experienced any number of different periods of suffering or just questions, I didn't write it out of that perspective, and that probably makes me a little bit different, and not better, just different, and actually quite weird. Really, it comes out of my moral reflections through history and through literature. That's really where it originated. That's why I go where I go with this. What I can say is that looking back on my life, I have a deep fascination with Christians who go one direction and suffer when everybody else is going the other way. And I've realized this is a theme. So I first started reading and researching the themes of this book when I was an undergraduate writing about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And you, of course, went to a seminary where Dietrich Bonhoeffer's bust is right there in the center with three other martyrs from the 20th century, with a dean who points to them, at least at the time Timothy George would point to them and say, this could be some of you. Sort of like a live sense, especially with Bonhoeffer's influence in that place, that following your faith could lead to very difficult outcomes. And that, by the way, is also why I teach so much, and I've taught at your church on this, why I teach civil rights, and why I focus on the Christians who did the opposite of what everybody else was going along with the flow on. But if you're gonna have that approach, then the area that's gonna heighten the entire experience is going to be the Holocaust, because you're gonna see what's the maximum amount of tragedy combined with the minimum number of people who put up a plausible defense against it, and especially from a convicted Christian perspective. So in some ways, it's a historical and a moral evaluation of kind of the hardest test cases that are expressions of the things that we feel individually and we think socially, but this is basically the extremes. Right. Of the above. So kind of thought, well, let's just jump to the extremes because our theology needs to be able to handle that. Then we'll work backward to the loss of your child or the loss of your spouse or the loss of your own health or things like that that are so horrible and so difficult, but the questions are universal. They're never less than personal, but they're often much more so than that. They're ultimately universal.
Yeah, I was struck, and the whole book is really framed around or at least a significant portion of the book, is framed around the particular evils that took place during the Holocaust and the different responses. And I was struck by that being your approach, because again, you could have gone, there were a lot of different, there's a lot of different tragedies in the world, and the Holocaust does seem to be like a uniquely horrifying event.
Yeah.
But you could have rooted it in other tragedies, or you could have rooted it in a more personal tragedies.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm curious, at what point did you know when you were writing the book, okay, the Holocaust is going to provide the framework for me, and here's why?
Well, part of it also, Cort, is because of how relevant those issues are in the last 4 years. So we have two different situations. You have the Hamas situation, October 7, 2023. This was the largest killing of Jews since the Holocaust. Then you also have the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. That's the first major land invasion in Europe since the end of World War II. So the Holocaust is newly fresh because of those situations. And also we've seen kind of a resurgent rise in anti-Semitism. In some ways, the Holocaust is not merely a figment of history, but it's also a relevant current situation. And in fact, many of the worst situations that happened in the Holocaust happened in Ukraine. So there's kind of the merging of those two. On top of that, there are many people. We could do something about the Armenians in early 20th century, that genocide. We could look at any number of different things here. That was Christians, largely, who were killed in that situation. But the fact that it happened to the Jewish people also naturally bridges you back to the biblical reflections. And not only that, but really, the reason I did this was because of my trip to Israel, going through Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Remembrance Center, seeing the picture in the end of Elie Wiesel being liberated from Buchenwald by the Americans, and then reading his book Night. And really, it all comes back down to that, saying that if I could identify the most effective atheistic text of the last 100 years, that would be it. Now, to qualify, Elie Wiesel did not describe himself as an atheist, but you'd be easily confused by reading this book, because the book is an atheistic attack on the notion of God. So where is God in a world with so much evil, the title of the book? Ellie's literal example from his book is, there hanging from the gallows in a concentration camp, we killed him. And that, of course, is going all the way back to Dostoevsky and the questions that he explored in the 19th century. So really, long answer to say, it's more or less a response to what Elie Wiesel offers, which I judge to be the most effective argument against theism, more broadly constructed, but especially the Judeo-Christian tradition in particular, or at least what we just called, at minimum, the Hebrew Bible.
Right. One of the things that really jumped out about that section of your book is you reference a historian, Alec Ryrie. Am I saying that right? His observation that after World War II, before World War II, Jesus was the moral reference point. That even people who didn't believe in Jesus, he was the moral reference point as this ultimate good in culture and in society. And then after World War II, he was replaced by Hitler as the ultimate version of evil. So we had this shift from our moral framework looking towards the ultimate good to instead just trying not to be the ultimate bad. Can you elaborate a little bit about how that shift has shaped our society? And then is don't be Hitler a sufficient ethic for our world?
So where I get a lot of head nods from people when I'm speaking on this topic is when I talk about the experience of evangelism. So you're talking with somebody about the Christian faith, and one of the most common questions, going back to some Presbyterian circles and the program Evangelism Explosion, if you were going to go to heaven today, what basis would you say that God should admit you? The dominant answer has been, in the last few generations, has been yes, because I'm a good person, or at least I've tried. And then if you push back, the standard for are you a good person is I'm not Hitler. Okay, so that kind of experience that we all have had, that we've all had just talking with people, that is a new experience. Talk about recent. That is a since World War II notion. Now, what I try to point out in the book is I take this to the extreme. Who is the most extreme example to somebody today who says, I'm a good person because I'm not as bad as Hitler. In fact, I'm a good person because I'm going against Hitler. That person is Vladimir Putin. His campaign to invade Ukraine was to, quote, denazify Ukraine. Now, I don't know about you, Cort, but I can't think of a more Nazi thing than to invade a neighboring European country led by a Jewish president. That seems pretty Nazi to me. But the idea was that if he can frame his invasion of Ukraine in terms of the Russian Great Patriotic War, which is how they understand Second World War, then it doesn't matter what he does, the children he steals or the innocent people on their way to church I was just reading about today that he kills for a pointless war, because it's already righteous, because it's denazifying. It's against Hitler. So my point was, there is a world of morality between I'm a good person and I'm not Hitler. You can be plenty bad and not Hitler. Even Putin, I don't think many of us would say he's as bad as Hitler. But does that somehow make him okay?
Well, let's dig into Dostoevsky for a second, because we've talked about the history element in the Holocaust, but then literature really does play a significant role in your book and how you frame some of these questions. For those of who are listening who have not necessarily read the Brothers Karamazov, can you just briefly summarize what are some of these themes that you're talking about? This question of I would say that book poses one of the most compelling, at least articulations of this problem of evil.
Yeah.
And the response to it.
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of surprised, Cort, that any church that you're the pastor of, everybody hasn't read Brothers Karamazov. I'm a little disappointed in your leadership there. I'm, of course, just completely kidding. It's really hard. It's a complicated book. It's confusing. Russian literature, the names, all sorts of stuff. It's all over the place. If I didn't have a mentor guiding me through it and being able to see it, I don't think I would have been able to make much progress at all. But really, when you're looking at Dostoevsky's two major works, and there's not his only works, he wrote many classics, but his two major works, Crime and Punishment and Brothers Karamazov, you're really dealing with variations on the same problem. So the problem in Crime and Punishment is the problem of what Nietzsche would later describe as the Übermensch, the Superman, the man who is above morality. He feels that he is justified in doing whatever he has for the greater good that only he understands. This was genius, of course, this horrible genius. Dostoevsky was identifying this in the arguments of the intellectual revolutionaries in Europe and Russia in the 19th century. We know this as Hitler and Stalin. He saw the problems coming. Our world had to live with them, the consequences. And Nietzsche, of course, picked this up explicitly, which got into the ecosystem that led to Nazism. The problem with Brothers Karamazov is related. It is the relationship between this intellectualized philosophizing about evil and this notion that, evil's just a moral construct. There is no true evil. In fact, without God, anything goes. And that's your central point in Brothers Karamazov. What, though you can do in a novel to illustrate this, just like you can use it through history to illustrate, is what happens when somebody takes that seriously. What would a society be when he said there is no God, therefore anything goes? And that's why the central conceit of the book is the musings of Ivan Karamazov, the skeptic. The he stands in for the intellectuals, and then the mystery, the murder mystery of who murders his father. And of course, what you find, spoiler alert, I think it's been a little bit longer, but what you find is that someone took him seriously. Somebody acted on his philosophy. So those are the basic ideas behind those, and there really is no match in history for Dostoevsky when it comes to a philosophical novelist. And that sounds more pretentious than it really is, because ultimately it comes down to this just basic ideas like, why do we have morals? And if there is no God, then what's the point? And then secondly, why should I have to follow the rules? What if I just get to do what I want because I know better than everybody else? And then, I just think, Cort, the way I bring this home is that our society is a thin veneer. If all of these protections of common grace that God has been so good to us with, if they disappeared, can you imagine a world where there is nothing but power? It's why I think that's probably why our generation loves dystopian movies and TV series so much, because that is basically the greatest fear. What if all these common graces were gone? And then you can start to think about what hell is. Imagine hell as a place where there are no common graces and no salvation. What would you do? How would people treat each other? Those are the basic ideas. I mean, they're set in stories, but those are what you're going to get primarily with Dostoevsky.
What are the alternative secular answers to the problem of evil? And then on the flip side, how does the Christian faith provide a sturdy foundation and a genuine hope in the midst of both the profound suffering at the global level that we see around the world, but then also the really intimate suffering that we experience in our own lives?
Oof, yeah, big questions. So good questions. So there are other responses. I'm going to focus on the secular. That's what you asked. Yes, the secular ones. Keep in mind, there are other religious traditions that answer these in different ways, whether it's Islam that approaches it more from a God sovereignty perspective, like, look, God's ways are inscrutable, we don't talk, whether it's a Hindu perspective, a Buddhist perspective. There's a lot of different notions, whether karma, of course, is one of the ways that deals with this. Reincarnation is a way that deals with this. Buddhism and Stoicism have some relation, essentially like detaching yourself from the world and from suffering is a way to do it. I mean, bottom line, I'll go back to the secular ones. Bottom line, what's unique about Christianity is the person of Christ, the suffering servant. Isaiah 52:53 carried through into the New Testament and Christ on the cross. The Son of God, without sin, offering himself as a sacrifice that avails to forgive us our sins. That is a notion that is simply absurd or unthinkable in other traditions. And of course, even within his own culture, in his own religion, that was still not accepted by everyone at the time. So that's the kind of the radical nature, whatever you want to say, that's Christianity's response. And weave it in with this book to Dostoevsky, because once again, how does Dostoevsky answer that? He doesn't answer it with a tight philosophy, but with a person and the ministry of Christ himself to condescend, to love the people, the very people who accuse him, which is kind of a variation on the book of Job. God sort of weaves all the, look, did you do this? Where were you when this happened? That kind of approach, but more of the suffering servant approach. But let's go back to the secular response. And again, I would say the reason the Christian response is compelling is precisely because it is so personal. It's the one that you can say, I have a God who understands, who sympathizes, who has entered into, a God who has done that. Not a man, not merely a man, I should say, a God-man, but not merely just another person who suffered, but a God who does it willingly, out of love. That is revolutionary. That's this kind of stuff that turned the world upside down. Let's go back to the secular responses, though. There's two. I mean, there's variations that you could look at here, but the two are pretty straightforward. The one is very uncommon, except in atheist discussion groups, but it's the one that is usually trotted out. It's that, look, yeah, anything goes. So it's all a power play, and you are a child if you are not willing to face the facts about this world. So that's how Christianity is seen as a child's religion, or a religion of the weak. So that would be closer to Nietzsche's approach. But there are very few people who can handle that reality. That's what Dostoevsky was getting at. They're very few. I mean, of course, what happens with people when they do that, there's a staggering tradition of suicides from people who hold those views. You can look at the existentialists as an example of this, because if everything's absurd, then yeah, you should probably just kill yourself, because at least then you can control something and you're not at the subject of everybody else's whims. The other response, though, is far more common. It's the one that you're going to see everywhere, which is that, yeah, so what? Yep, This is the way things are, and these are the rules. These are the morals. Well, who says? No one says. So why should I have to follow them? Because you do. That doesn't make sense. That's circular reasoning. Well, yeah, but so essentially just the idea that it's really Romans 1. We all have a sense of justice. We can't really live without a sense of justice, but we deny our Creator. So that's mostly how people go through life, is by saying there is a morality, and I'm pretty much supposed to go by it, more or less, but it's not universal because I don't want to be beholden to someone else, but somehow we all just have to kind of do it. Like, it's really good if everybody else follows the rules, and I'll follow the rules as much as I feel like I should, but I'm not going to go around like Raskolnikov does in Crime and Punishment and kill people to make a point of it. I just might cut a few corners, maybe jaywalk a little bit.
I was really struck by what you said about the Christian hope and the Christian answer. It's this idea that we have a God who enters in and who actually can sympathize with us. Like, we have a crucified God. And so I think there's that. And then, but it even goes, like, what I love about the Christian faith is it even goes a step further, is we have a God who enters in, sympathizes, and then does something about
Then
it.
conquers it.
And then conquers it.
And
like
then conquers it.
Because a God who can sympathize with us, like, that is monumental.
Yeah.
But then the fact that he actually does something about it, and that there will be a day where it's definitively taken care of.
And that's the only basis in which you can trust God's justice. If Christ is not raised from the dead, if he's not coming back, then it doesn't matter what he taught. It doesn't matter what he modeled. It would still be a sham. So you're right. You're exactly right. The cross is part of the equation. It's a necessary part of the equation. Without the resurrection and without the second advent, then we're still hopeless there. So yeah, that's how it all fits together, no doubt.
Last question. So let's say someone comes to you and is wrestling with this issue. What counsel would you give someone who is navigating their own experience of particularly God's silence in the midst of suffering? There's an earnest desire to cry out to him. They're not running from him, but still feel like they're hitting that silence.
Yeah, two points there, Cort. And we all experience this personally. Pastors and elders were reaching out and helping people with this. As friends, we're just reaching out and doing this. One of the beautiful things we can always fall back on is knowing that God is never truly silent because he speaks in his word. And that's one of the most beautiful, basic, elementary things that is so profound about Christianity. God's never silent. He's always speaking through his word. And what you find in his word is a lot of people whose cries out to God you can relate to. And I love the way that they pray God's character back to him or lament his character back to him. God, how could you allow this to happen? Because this is who you said you are. This is who I know you to be. So I can't reconcile these two things together. So praying God's character back to him the way that Habakkuk does, the way that the psalmists do, on and on through there, is the first way to do it. The second way, borrowing here a little bit from Tim Keller and some others, but I want to encourage people in that situation to doubt their doubts. In other words, it's easy to react against the thing that you have held without considering the alternatives. So you may say Christianity has a problem with evil, and certainly I think that's probably the case, meaning that we don't have a perfect explanation for why every evil thing happens. It's not possible. But I would love to know what alternatives give a more satisfying response. And I would also love to know how anyone in other approaches have an answer for good. So we just kind of take those for granted, especially if you're grown up Christian, you're in a Christian environment. It's easy to see the cracks in your own house, your own foundation, without knowing what's happening in everybody else's houses. So just kind of an encouragement to doubt your doubts. One, He's always speaking. He's always speaking in his word. And you'll be amazed by how comforting it is, not only the hope of what you point to, but even the darkness that you can relate to that is sanctified and even inerrant in the scriptures. But second, let's consider the alternatives. I'll just end this answer on a story. I share this in the book, but there's a friend of mine talking about a tough situation in his church, and this guy had experienced something that is probably the most equivalent to Job from the Bible that I'd ever heard before. And as he's talking, he mentions that this guy has left their church and he's left the faith. He's denounced the faith. And I just asked an earnest, genuine question back to this guy who was talking about this man in his church. I said, did it help? Did it help him when he walked away from the faith? Because what's interesting is that it was not this man's Christian faith that was causing any of these problems. Now, if you want to talk martyrdom or something like that, let's have that conversation, okay? But oddly enough, you don't hear this from the martyrs. Make note of that.
Yeah.
You don't hear them wrestling in the problem of evil the same way. Anyway, but because in some ways they've resolved to understand this question. But so it's not martyrdom. And I'm just thinking he didn't experience these things because of his Christian faith. But without his Christian faith, he lost the only hope of resolution. So that's the simple encouragement to all of us. We're all in those moments or going to be in those moments. Just recognize that however silent God seems, there's always his word, and there's always the possibility that he does know what he's doing because he is God and he loves you.
Collin, thank you so much. That's, I think, a great place for us to end this conversation on that word of hope. The book is Where is God in a World with So Much Evil? We'll link to it in our show notes, and I encourage all of y'all to pick it up and give it a read. Collin, thanks so much.
Thanks, Cort.
You've been listening to Common Life. To learn more about our church, visit us at southhighland.org. If you're in Birmingham, come worship with us one Sunday. We would love to have you. As always, our theme music comes from Jeremy Moore, whose album Pillars is on Spotify and wherever you listen to music. See you next time.